sunshine comes from the east, till the light of the dark is coming. We are all up in our eyes, we are all up in our heart, we are all up in our mind, under the same sky. Not only one in blood and land, not only one on skin's color and language. We have one spirit, we're one in struggle. Let's raise our dreams together. We can, we are young together. Hey, hey, ah, ah, hey, ah, ah. It's time to get up, follow and build somebody. Let's go, we step together. One spirit to go. Great. Hey, ah, ah, hey, ah, ah, hey, ah, not only one in blood and land, not only one on skin's color and language. We have one spirit, we're one in struggle. Let's reach our dream together. We can, we are young together. Hey, hey, ah, ah, ah. Hey, ah, ah. It's time to get up, hold your hand, build somebody. Let's go, we step together. One spirit to go. Great. Hey, ah, ah, hey, ah, ah, hey, ah, we are the winner generation. Lift as high as you can, hold as much as you can, bend as beautiful as you can, breathe the best into the world.
So, good evening, everyone. My name is Ruth Perello, and I will be your host for tonight's webinar. So, before we begin, if any of you have questions regarding the discussion, don't hesitate to send them to us by entering it in the comment section of whatever social media platform you're watching this on, and I'll be here to relay them to our guest speaker. So, welcome to the live webinar series of ESME.ph, an e-learning marketplace for Filipino professionals where one can develop relevant and in-demand skills through master classes in different fields of learning. If you want to learn more about us, feel free to visit our page at www.esme.ph. For those who are watching on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, feel free to share the link to this stream to people who you think will be interested in today's topic. So this webinar is in partnership with the Rotary Club of Alabang Madrigal Business Park, District 3830, Zone 10, a five-star Rotary Club of dynamic and fun-loving visionary leaders of the community who are wholeheartedly giving back to the society through service and advocacy. They are looking to add to their membership so that they can do even more, not only in their community and throughout the world. If you are looking to make a contribution to the welfare of others and see yourself as a person who can live up to their motto of service above self, all while having fun and enjoying the fellowship of club members, then you should join the Rotary. This is also in partnership with the Rotaract Club of Alabang Madrigal Business Park, ASEAN Youth Organization Philippines, JCI Alabang, Rotaract One ASEAN, United Nations Youth Associations of the Philippines, Montessori de Oro, and Youth Development Affairs Office Laguna. So I have a question for you guys. So do you sometimes wonder how our past experiences, trauma, and behavior affect or impact the advancement of our democracy? Or do our choices have something to do with it? Well, this webinar will discuss the status of human rights in the international community or a broad group of people. It will answer how bringing a trauma informed perspective, meaning recognizing trauma related symptoms and behaviors, can impact the advancement of democracy. Let me, guys, welcome you to Human Rights, a Trauma Informed Analysis, and the Advancement of Democracy. By now, you must be wondering who our speaker is. Well, I won't make it you wait any longer. So she graduated from George Washington University in 2018 with the degree of Bachelor of Arts in International Affairs. And this year, 2021, she obtained her Master of Science in Legal Studies from the University of San Diego School of Law, which she graduated with honors. She is currently a social justice volunteer in the U.S. ASEAN Youth Council, a volunteer intern for the Young Professional and International Affairs, and a Young Ambassador Program event and communication coordinator for Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security and Conflict Transformation. She is also an author of Human Rights in Latin America, a review, which features the young professionals in international affairs, and co-authored of The Opinion, Vaccine Apartheid in Context, which talks about the women of color advancing peace and security. With that being said, our audience will surely learn a lot from her. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome our speaker, Miss Alexi Santiago.
Thank you, Ruth, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be here with everyone, and I'm excited to give this talk about human rights, a trauma-informed analysis. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions, provide any resources, and put you in the right direction. This is just the beginning of this conversation. There's a lot more research, there's a lot more advancement that needs to happen to continue the conversation, to increase the advancement of human rights on a local level, even if that's in the United States, if that's even in the Philippines, at an international level, with the justice system, and even with foreign policy. We still have a lot of work to do, but my hope here is that we can engage in a conversation about this topic. I'll provide some definitions, and hopefully we'll just keep the conversation going and just put ourselves in the right direction, put the youth of our countries in the right direction so that we can help advance human rights for ourselves and for the people who are coming, the generations to come after us. So let's go ahead and get started. Awesome. So The goal of this seminar is to highlight an approach to advocacy for any person who is an advocate themselves, a researcher, a caseworker, or someone who provides, analyzes, or works with victims, witnesses, or represents either victims or witnesses, also including anyone in the legal, nonprofit, or in intergovernmental or non-governmental agencies. The reason why a trauma-informed approach to human rights is important to the advancement of democracy is because the foundation of a democracy is pertinent to the advancement of people and relies on people, individuals. We make up our governments, we make up our communities, we provide, social justice programs to other people who are not fortunate. It's people-centered, and we must acknowledge even traumas that have happened to family members who may not have had the opportunity to address their traumas, but even people from generations prior, not just family members, but communities who've experienced atrocities such as genocide, ethnic cleansing, religious persecution. All of these actions contribute to what trauma creates. What is trauma? And so this is why this is important, because if we do not address mental health, if we do not address what trauma is, then it just continues in a cycle. And we as youth, we as people who are trying to advance our societies must address these issues. So the issue with identifying key actors in advocacy is very important, especially to seeking resources for trauma, mental health issues, but can also be a very challenging action, can be a challenging endeavor. Sometimes you might receive negative feedback. You might have challenges of resources, maybe not enough money to go talk to somebody, a therapist, any person, or a doctor. Healthcare could be challenging, a challenging system to navigate. So if there isn't a specialized department or a person in your community who works on trauma and addressing trauma issues, trauma-based issues, or mental health, then we suggest that you talk to the closest thing to a healthcare provider or contact a non-governmental organization. There are some internationally who do provide mental health services, so I'd be happy to point anyone in those directions if you do want or need that help. So protesting for the advancement of democracy may come into play with the challenges such as environmental issues, the challenges, social issues that are coming up, that are continuing in our countries. So it is very important, and we are seeing a lot more protests, and it's just continuing even prior to COVID and continuing post-COVID in many countries and across several continents. I think one question we must address in this conversation is, what is a democracy? Is there a specific definition? Is it based on country? Is it based on a person's perspective and experience? So it seems that scholars can conclude that there is not one accepted example of what a democracy is. Quite shocking, which contributes to the plethora of definitions that are in written publications and on the internet. But ultimately, there are levels of democracy that include components such as institutional accountability to the public and individual and civil liberties. By levels of democracy, I mean that A country, for instance, may have voting rights given to their constituents and their the citizens of the country. So you may just have voting rights. For instance, maybe just the male population has access to voting, and women may not still have access. That is one base level of what democracy is, and there are several components. So, are there women who are representative in the government? Are women voted in? Are people who are sitting in the government voted in general? There's so many layers to what a democracy is. And as we've seen in the past, the United States is somewhat of an example of what a democracy is, but it is not the only example. It is not the primary gem of what a democracy is. And it should not just be the only example. We must look at other countries who do have some rights for their individuals, some civil liberties, to accurately assess what a democracy is. And when I say individual liberties, I mean freedoms such as freedom from the discrimination of race, ethnicity, or national origin, which means that you should not be discriminated for a job or employment based off of your ethnicity. If you are Black, Asian, white, you should not be discriminated against for employment. These liberties and rights could include the right to vote, but not the right to protest as well. So vice versa, it depends. Another component of and level of this conversation is what is trauma? That's a big word and another multi-layered topic and word. So we're going to dissect it right now. So is trauma a single experience? Is trauma the experience of witnessing another person experience death or injury? Is trauma intergenerational? While this seminar will not go into the depths of trauma, it will provide some key perspectives when trauma is at play. On a global scale, we can view trauma as the direct contact of an experience that one person carries. According to the American Psychological Association, trauma is the emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. Or, according to the British Medical Journal, trauma is defined as actual or threat of death, serious injury, or accident, or sexual violence. The expansion of these definitions are exemplified in the UN's approach to human rights and disaster response. As noted in the Manual on Monitoring Human Rights, Chapter 12, Trauma and Self-Care for Human Rights Officers, this is a viable resource for any person working in this field or in a related field. Trauma can occur during many situations, like during immigration procedures, separation of families and children, forced displacement, torture, either experienced or witnessed, and even sexual violence, either experienced or witnessed. When assessing trauma, it is best to understand the source of the traumatic event and the age at which it occurred. I encourage any person watching this seminar to take the time to educate yourself more on how to communicate and understand coping mechanisms for trauma in order to ethically work with someone who has experienced trauma. And this may mean how you communicate a person and how you yourself, if you take on the emotions of another person, if you bear the weight of who you're talking to and who you're working with, you yourself also have the responsibility to work on your self-care and coping mechanisms with trauma. So why is trauma a trauma-informed approach important to the advancement of democracy. A key component of ensuring the advancement of democracy in any society within the levels of democracy are amplification and trust. We must ask ourselves, whose voices are we amplifying? Are we uplifting the voices of farmers who are not able to put food on their own tables because of markets and limited availability of gas? Are we uplifting the voices of families who've been living in refugee camps for 2 years, too long? Or are we focused on uplifting the voices of people who are already in closed-door government meetings? When we assess human rights in this way, we can make sound judgments about who is left out of important conversations. To effectuate a viable analysis of what the extension of the trauma-informed approach would be to a democracy, I created a case study to demonstrate how, in the face of human rights violations, stakeholders and actors how they should process the situation. This can even be advocated for on behalf of the public in this situation as it applies to a quote on democracy, to quote unquote democracy. To be an effective advocate, one must understand and process the potential impacts that trauma can have on anyone who has survived it. So in the case of State of Cahusi, this is a made-up country, not based on any specific country's actual status. So the facts of the case are international non-governmental organizations report ethnic cleansing in the form of religious minority groups being targeted by state military. The president of Cahusi was voted into office for a 5-year term in 2019. Proof of targeting by leaked photographs of villages have been burned down. So we have the photo proof. There's a rapid influx of refugees in a major refugee camp nearby. And UN ground forces, along with several other humanitarian organizations from UN party countries, have witnessed accounts of violence against women and children. And so due to these facts, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has recently announced that the alleged crimes took place in the capital called Mohusi and is within the Rome Statute, which means if it's in the Rome Statute, it clears the jurisdictional requirement to proceed with a rapporteur report, meaning that the crimes that are claimed will be investigated and potentially brought to court. This is a considerably long process. And so this case definitely touches on the international aspect of justice. And so if we know that it's going to take a long time for justice to be had at the international justice level, we can note that there are other approaches to getting justice for the refugees, the people involved, and even understanding the human rights approach, human rights trauma-informed approach to this case. So on the note of refugees leaving their homelands to travel to another country, or the individuals, which means that the individuals are afforded minimal standards of protection. So because they left their homeland to travel to another country, they are afforded that protection based on the international agreement and treaty with the Rome Statute, and being a party of the UN, they are afforded basic protection by the government when they enter into a new territory. So, with this being said, the people on the ground the NGOs are able to amplify the voices of those who've experienced an injustice. So as I mentioned before, whose voices are we amplifying? We In this case, it would be optimal to amplify the voices of those who are moving to another country for fear of persecution, who've experienced the trauma of being targeted, and so that there may be some social justice in the meantime of international justice, legal justice not being had. Any type of ethnic cleansing would exacerbate the level of urgency for threat of trauma. And specifically with women and children, as I mentioned before, age really does matter um, when the trauma has occurred, because it depends how the person does react to the trauma. But if there's a child who does experience trauma and they're used to seeing said trauma, it would be best to give them the resources so that they are able to cope, they are able to move past, move forward, and be the best selves that they can be. And as I mentioned, mental health resources should be offered to the refugees in the camps that they go to when they travel and when they relocate, and especially for those who are granted asylum in another country. So when they get to their new country after having left their original country, their country of origin, they should have the mental health support um, so that they can transition into a new society. Because oftentimes, if you're transitioning into a new society, that may mean learning a new language. That may mean interacting with people you've never interacted with before, taking on a job that you have to learn brand new. And that could be very compounding with and very stressful. So having the mental health support and understanding of what trauma these people may have witnessed, occurred, and felt is very important in their transition and success going forward. And so the key takeaways from this case study is that the action of protesting is a motivated way to feel empowered when human rights issues are present. Another component, like the levels of democracy, are the levels of advocacy. Levels of advocacy can include protests, like maybe we have seen in Colombia during COVID, protests in America with regard to the Black Lives Matter movement, protests in Japan, everywhere. These could be at a local level, but also there's other forms of advocacy as well, and that takes place and really is determined based on the status of democracy in that specific country. And so it is fundamental to note that the promotion of human rights develops democracy. To reach either of these goals, the human race can neither advance nor any of the progresses we have made reach our full potential if either democracy or human rights are hindered. And so, with that being said, that is the presentation that I have for you all. I would be happy to provide resources about any of the things that I've touched on. There's a lot of reading, but luckily there are resources that are available to minimize the amount of information for intake, and I'd be happy to provide those. So just want to thank ESME Rotary International for the opportunity to speak with your audience to conference.
Okay, thank you very much, Miss Alexi. So that is a very inspiring talk and presentation you've given to us. So if it's okay with you, we shall proceed to the question and answer portion. with regard to the topic that you discussed. So here is our first question. So why is it important to discuss human rights in the international community?
It is important to address and discuss human rights in the international community because every single person really does experience some sort of issue with human rights. There is not one country, at least that I can think of, that is a perfect example of human rights. So I think that we can all learn from each other, and continuing the conversation about this topic is very important.
Okay, thank you very much for answering that question. And I would also like to agree with what you've said. It's a really nice, that is a really nice reason why we should discuss human rights in the international community, regardless on where we are right at the moment. So with that, we shall proceed with the next question. What is the relationship between human rights and the trauma-informed perspective, and how are they related with each other?
Yes, so trauma and human rights are related because if, say, as for example, with the have an injustice that being is being witnessed or being experienced by an individual, a community, or a group, those people who are being impacted could potentially have anxiety. They could have some undue stress that they wouldn't have had if that injustice did not occur. So, no worries, Ruth. So, to continue.
Would that be all for the previous question, Miss Alexi?
Oh no, I'm actually one more point just to state that it's just important because the impacts of trauma can supersede a person. For instance, it could be intergenerational, it could be passed down, and it's better to just address those, and it helps the advancement of human rights because people, when you have an injustice that you experience, it takes away your power. And so the feeling of powerlessness decreases the advancement of human rights and the advancement of the empowerment of people and even in democracy.
Okay, thank you very much for that insightful answer for the second question. So, in relation to what you've said, so have we made any progress in reducing human rights violation by then?
Thank you for that question. So that's a complex question. Really, I think that progress in the form of social justice activism, social justice movements, and the organization of protests in and of itself have progressed human rights. However, even on the level of international justice, we know that even for cases like Myanmar, with the International Criminal Court, justice is slow moving. It's a slow process. So I think that if we do rely on, looking at a full scope perspective and picture of what is really happening on an individual level, social level, just like what's happened in countries like Nigeria following the SARS movement, which is still happening in protest in response to the Colombian government economic and health policies, we can see some progress.
Okay, that's good to hear. At least we're making some progress with regard to reducing human rights violation. But um, to follow that question, and then to follow your answer as well. So what is the number one way we can make a substantial difference in the international community, if there is?
I think that think that if we, like I mentioned before, if we continue the conversation like we are doing now, I'm in the United States and you're in the Philippines right now. We have people from every country just talking, even if you're not working. So, say if you're not working for the UN, even as an international non-governmental organization or nonprofit, that we do continue to talk about these issues and just amplify, like I mentioned before, whose voices are we amplifying? Sometimes we do have to amplify our own voices, and we should do that too to help our other neighboring countries and fellow youth amplify their voices in issues that they believe are important. So I do think that that's a positive way.
Would that be all, Miss Alexi, for that question? Okay. This is a quite a follow-up question because you've mentioned about amplifying the voices. Is speaking up in social media these days a great way to amplify the voices of those people?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
You've mentioned a while ago that um, we as the youth we must amplify the voices of those who needs to be amplified. So these days being vocal in social media is in trend like in Twitter, Facebook. So do you think that's a good start or an instrument or means to fight or to amplify what our advocacy is like that?
Mhm. I think that it's a double-edged sword. Like with social media, um, and Facebook, for instance, with the and I'm bringing up the Myanmar issue again, is that we've seen that injustices have actually been taken actually acted on because of the negative uprising on social media. So it could be positive, and especially in the sense of, like I mentioned, the SARS movement in Nigeria. For me, we were in the United States. I saw several newsreels, not newsreels, but just posters and posts about what's really happening. And there are organizations that are amplifying those things. So in that aspect, yes. But I also do believe that social media it's the internet, and is that enough? Who's really seeing it? But I do think it is positive to at least start the conversation.
Okay, thank you very much for addressing that extra question. I feel honored for that. So let's proceed with the next question. So aside from those we've mentioned, so what other things impact the advancement of democracy?
Again, sorry, but I know that it is really complex. I think that the advancement of democracy is impacted by who's in office. It's impacted by the status of, say, employment in an individual country. It's the status of education. It's the status of the type of policies, the type of foreign policies that a country has with other countries, the type of agreements that a country has with other countries. It's it's the economic status as well. So there's a lot of components that go into to that.
Okay. Will that be all, Miss Alexi, for that
Yes.
question?
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, I also agree with what you've said. Politics, yeah, it takes a big role in the advancement of democracy.
No.
Okay, so I think we're down to our last question. So without further ado, I'll ask it. So what are the common misconceptions people have on human rights, trauma, and democracy? And then how can we combat these misconceptions?
So I'll start with giving a misconception for each because I think there are probably several. And I probably also don't know every single misconception because there's just so much out there. So I do believe that the misconception with human rights is that it's only at an international level. I think human rights is multi-layered as anything is in the world, especially nowadays. So it is not just international. It could be on a state level, especially in the United States, with who actually has access to voting. I think voting rights is a good example of seeing where countries are at as far as human rights. And a misconception as far as trauma um, is that maybe witnessing a trauma doesn't necessarily meet the requirements of being traumatized. I think that if you witness something, and any atrocity, it could be, rape, burning of houses, it could be being forcefully displaced from your home, or watching others do that. I do think that that takes a toll on a person, um, and causes them to experience something that they would not have normally felt if they hadn't seen or witnessed that event or persecution or whatever it may be. And then a misconception about the advancement of democracy is that maybe it could happen overnight. And I think as what we witnessed and seen in the past few years is that it is not an overnight process.
Okay, so you've already enumerated misconceptions. So what can you say on how we can combat these misconceptions that you've mentioned?
I think that, just individual person can do their individual research on these topics, but also educating yourself on what I've said, what you have said, what other people are talking about, and even encouraging um, encouraging these discussions. I think that talking about issues and is just the start, and it's a very good start because then you can ask a question that you wouldn't normally ask, and you could ask a professor. You could reach out to people in your community, non people who are a part of your non-governmental organizations. You can take a course that's free online, like this one, and you can just be engaged. Just being actively engaged, I do think increases your awareness.
Okay, that thank you very much, Miss Alexi, for answering the last question. I would also have to agree with what you've mentioned regarding how to combat this misconceptions, especially these days. We really need to be aware of what's happening, not only within the country or within our country, but also being aware with the others. And that I think that's really a great um, action, I guess.
Mhm.
Like, even small steps, at least we're trying to become more engaged of what's happening
Right.
around us and with them.
I agree.
Okay, so that is a very insightful talk from you, Miss Alexis Santiago. I know our audience learned a lot. So before we end, on behalf of ESME Philippines, I would like to thank you, Miss Alexis Santiago, for taking the time to do a webinar with us and discuss human rights. And we really appreciate your kind presence in our webinar. It is not only informative, but it is also an eye opener. So I hope being part of this webinar is a positive experience for you as well. And we can thank you enough for accepting our invitation for and for sharing your knowledge and expertise expertise. With that, Miss Alexi, is there anything you want to say or promote before we formally end?
I would just like to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak on this topic and to continue the conversation. And um, I would just keep a lookout for further events from ESME. This is a great program, and I really think that tuning in and learning virtually from a free resource is very vital, and everyone should take note and take part, and it'll help everyone.
Okay, thank you very much again, Miss Alexi. We really enjoyed your company here. So once again, thank you for enriching our event with your presence and your insightful thoughts.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you. Have a good day. So before this webinar comes to a close, I would like to invite everyone who wants to learn more and increase their knowledge and skills. Just visit our website at www.sme.ph. We offer a wide range of masterclass courses, those of which you enroll based on whatever is relevant to our passion, career, and interests. We would like to acknowledge our partners for making this webinar possible. Rotary Club of Alabang, Madrigal Business Park, District 3830, Zone 10A, and Rotaract Club of Alabang Madrigal Business Park, ASEAN Youth Organization Philippines, JCI Alabang, Rotaract 1 ASEAN, United Nations Youth Associations of the Philippines, Montessori de Oro, and Youth Development Affairs Office Laguna. Again, once again, our guest speaker, Miss Alexi Santiago. Ladies, lastly, ladies and gentlemen who attended this webinar, may I thank you very much for your participation in this webinar. I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot. Thank you so much and have a great evening.